Welcome to Breaking Banks.
Happy holidays, everyone. This is our last show of 2022, and we're going to end the year by looking back at how we started it. Brett, Jason, and I got together in January with some predictions, and we'll find out just how clear our crystal balls were. Spoiler alert, none of us predicted the crash in crypto prices or bankruptcy filings by some of the biggest platform players, global price spikes, or Twitter being taken private by Elon Musk, but we did get a few things right. We all agreed on the need for financial institutions to better vet and manage fintech partnerships and the need to have a viable strategy beyond traditional M&A. Jason saw fintech valuations coming back to earth, a slowdown of the fintech funding frenzy, and some early cracks in the foundations of interchange. Brett was looking forward to advances in AI, AR, and VR, and we were all cautiously optimistic on the sufficiency and efficacy of the technical and compliance infrastructure needed to support the global growth of crypto and DeFi. We'll be back next week with our first show of 2023, and we'll kick off our ongoing celebration of 10 years of Breaking Banks. Brett first sat down behind the mic in 2013. We're starting the new year by dusting off those crystal balls once again, and this time we invited some of the best minds in banking, fintech, and decentralized finance to join us with a mega mix of forecasts. You'll hear from the likes of Jim Maroose, Lita Glyptis, Ron Shevlin, Chris Skinner, Liz Lumley, Dave Birch, Mary Wisniewski, Paulo Cerrone, and more. But for now, let's take a look back to less than a year ago, before the Winter Olympics in Beijing, before the monkeypox outbreak, and before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, all those just happened this year. Both Jason Henriks and Brett King join me today as we take a little bit of a look back, but mostly a look forward. So, Jason, maybe I'll start with you. What were a couple of the big things that really stood out for you as you look back to 2021?
Well, I mean, it was interesting as we looked at 2020 and what COVID began, to bring, and everyone suddenly was on board with digital transformation. And I would say 2021 is when that really came to bear, that, all of the deniers, I think, were finally silenced, because this idea of, a quick pandemic and we're going to be back to the branch. And by the way, our customers love to come into the branch. Well, that went away. Found out even when branches opened up that a lot of these customers had discovered, digital and convenience, and they wanted to stick with it. I would also say that 2021 was the year that we could definitively point to and say, fintech is also not going away. That, you can look at, the growth and the fact that a number of these have achieved, profitability or near profitability, that, fintech is here to stay. I would also say, it'll be interesting to look back and say 2021, was that the peak of the hype curve for a lot of this? And we're going to see, some of that begin to crumble, because it also feels like there was a challenger bank of X, Y, and Z segment, being funded every other day right now. And I don't know that some of those segmentations are actually relevant.
Brett, what stuck out for you?
Well, obviously, Q1, beat all previous quarters in terms of funding for fintech. Then Q2 beat Q1, and then Q3 beat Q2. And we don't have the Q4 results yet, but it was clearly the biggest, year of funding for fintech that we've seen since this sort of journey started back in, say, 2008. I guess is when most people talk about the start of the fintech boom from a funding perspective. Of those funding, the couple of interesting ones is obviously we had a ton of neobanks, Varo, Chime, in the US, N26, Revolut, Monzo in the UK. But the big news, of course, was Nubank. After raising $750 million, they then went on to list in December of 2021. And did so closing out with a market cap of 50 billion, which makes them the largest bank in the Brazilian market, beating out Itaú, which is valued at about 39 billion. Now, the reason for their better valuation than their Itaú, which is a long time brand in the LATAM market, is their growth. They're at 48 million customers already. They're growing at 20% annually, and Itaú has 55 million after, 85 years of operation or whatever it is. And so why that's important, as Jason said, that fintech's really hit a stride. But we are now starting to see that some of the biggest banks in their respective markets are fintechs. N26 is the second largest bank in the German market. WeBank in Shenzhen is in the top 20 banks in China. If you take it by customers, they're in the top 5 banks in China. So this debate that was often had before the pandemic, that fintech was a fad, as soon as they had to deal with some real crises, then we'll see what they're made of. The run of challenger banks is going to be over as soon as people start looking for real profitability out of these banks. All of that has proven to be wrong. Right? And fintech blew through those objections to really start dominating. What it also shows is, if you look at the big IPOs we've had this year, Coinbase, Robinhood, TransferWise and so forth, we are starting to see these become sort of mainstream brand names as well for many of these organizations. So when you look at this, not just in 2022, but looking out, say, further to 2030, it's fairly clear now that the largest banks or FIs globally, and we've been saying this for a few years on the show, but the largest FIs globally are going to be those that are digitally oriented. And so we are really starting to see the last days of the traditional players in terms of dominance of this industry. That's what I think 2021, was all about in terms of fintech. I hope that's not too grandiose a statement, but.
Well, Brett, building on that, I think one of the other things we're going to see when we look back, right, there was this race originally. Props to Lindsay Davis, who's on the show, not nearly enough, but this unbundling, graphic that she created for CB Insights. Now we see the rebundling. We're just calling it the building of super apps. And it's as if this idea of, hey, if we shove enough stuff together digitally, that somehow is better. That I think the trend I hope we see in 2022 is not just a rebundling of services in a digitally first fashion, but we actually see that the largest banks, the smaller banks, the fintechs actually pull back and say, what's the unique strategy and value proposition that I go against it, put against this? Because I think the super app is the equivalent of Sam's Club and Costco. There's maybe room in this space for one or two of them, but not everyone needs a super app for everything. But that being said, I don't go to Costco and Sam's Club for everything, right? There's plenty of space that don't go compete to be the super app of everything if you don't have the economies of scale.
Well, I think I've always argued the experiential play is about a different view of the world, right? Which is, you go to Sam's Club for a collection of products, right? But when it comes to financial services, particularly the success we saw with Buy Now, Pay Later this year, I think that's where it gets pretty interesting to look at contextual credit, behavioral savings, a smart money coach built into your life. And so it's not necessarily super apps, but I do think the operating systems of the 21st century, the smart glasses and, the smart speakers and those sort of things are going to introduce us to this experiential world where you've just got access at your fingertips to these core services. The 21st century is all going to be about access to digital services. The pandemic has just given us a glimpse of this. Telemedicine, instead of going to the doctors, as you said, using a banking app instead of going to the bank branch, hybrid education for our kids, hybrid events, for networking and things like that. We're just starting to see the exploration of sort of the digital services layer of the 21st century for mainstream access to services. Fintech has to power that. Digital identity is required. Is clearly seeing. We are starting to see sort of the division in the world now now between the haves and nots in respect to core identity infrastructure. The US trails significantly from the likes of China there, and so it's this is sort of this inflection point, and the super apps are interesting platforms, but I do think, as a futurist, I tend to see them as transitional to more of the sort of experience-led world. It'll be interesting this year. We hope to see the launch of a couple of sets of AR-based, smart glasses from Apple and from the Meta team at Oculus, and I think that's where it gets really interesting, because the super app doesn't help you in a glasses context, right? It needs to be much more contextual. It needs to be much more highly targeted. You can't spam people with information, and it needs to be much simpler in terms of execution. So I do think we are going to have a bit of a revolution in terms of the way we think about experience delivery and content delivery, moving forward with the computing platforms that we're going to see this decade. But, again, that's sort of the futurist lens rather than, a pure fintech, practitioner approach.
Well, neither of you mentioned crypto or Web3 or DeFi, which are all somewhere fit into some sort of Venn diagram. They're kind of related. How early do you think we still are in that relative to where we ended 2021, and what's going to happen in that space this year?
Crypto's over a decade old now. The Satoshi white paper was 2008, but having said that, NFTs and sort of this exploration of distributed autonomous organizations, DAOs, and so forth. We are still very much in the infancy of the application of crypto and distributed ledger technology in terms of sort of building the world of the future. But we are seeing efforts at digitizing not only money and artwork or IP in respect to NFTs, but the ability to sort of think about coding corporations and coding operations at a meta level. And that doesn't even get us into the whole metaverse conversation. Obviously, from a Web3 perspective, there's a big push. We're going to see some concerted efforts this year to look at decentralized efforts at metaverse. Having said that, though, I'm a little skeptical, because I think the compute requirements for VR and mixed reality worlds will require a big investment in data centers, and so I don't necessarily see how the decentralized world does that. Having said all of that, let's look at what's going to happen this year. We will have the Beijing Olympics with the launch of the first central bank digital currency sort of broad scheme, for end consumers in a set of mobile wallets, including China's own mobile wallets. That's a super significant milestone. Think about the last time that fiat currency really had an evolution, right? It was the move from coins to paper. Really, that was the last major evolution. So this is I don't think people understand the magnitude of this event in respect to the evolution of money. But that world that's coming off the back of what happened with Bitcoin and distributed ledger, it has so much momentum now. It costs it passed the $3 trillion of total market cap barrier last year. Of course, it's come down a little bit in the bear market. But having said that, there is so much investment going into the crypto space that's inevitable that these cryptocurrencies sitting alongside central bank digital currencies and digitized assets are going to be a very strong part of the way we sort of deal with the transition to this mixed reality world, moving from physical assets, physical contracts to hybrid and digital assets and sort of contracts. And it's a very, very interesting time. It's not been widely predicted in sort of science fiction in the past. So it's a really interesting divergence from that stuff that I find interesting anyway.
Well, but right, it is clear when we look at science fiction, I forced myself to go back to reading it. I used to think that, oh, it was a guilty pleasure. And the reality is what is imagined in science fiction so often comes to pass. Whether it's because they saw the future, they gave us a vision of what the future could be, and we went out and built it. But one of those visions I want to call out when we talk about DAOs, these distributed autonomous organizations, that was not imagined to be digital. That is not a blockchain or a crypto thing, right? So Engine, the game company, was one of the first to roll out and operate as a DAO. It's just technology is enabling it to become more mainstream. And I think one of the things we're going to have to look at, just as blockchain became the buzzword, and then everyone realized, oh, maybe I don't actually need blockchain. Maybe this idea of a distributed ledger, and it doesn't even have to be a public ledger. Maybe it's a private ledger. I think we're going to see the same thing in DAOs, which is we kind of overshoot. Oh, it has to run on ETH. And then we realize, oh, the computing power isn't there, or it actually is really bad for the environment, given the amount of energy it takes. Then we realize the concept is right. The implementation is wrong. Let's pull back a little bit and then begin to scale it. But I think DAOs are one of those places that I think we're going to see a lot of interesting development, but it doesn't necessarily run on the blockchain to start. That's
No, I agree with that.
Bringing the cannon, when you need a BB gun to start.
I think the other area that's sort of gaining some momentum now is that, all of this digital activity is requiring significant regulatory reform. Right. And so, I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of regulators, I don't think regulators have ever been as busy as they are in the financial services space as they are at the moment in terms of future visioning. But we've also, heard the likes of Elon Musk and others being very critical of the fact that legislation often doesn't go through review, and we just tend to add more and more laws on the books. And so as we start to look at automating government and automating the legal system, which is largely inevitable, we're going to have to go through massive review of laws on the book and look at simplifying those to put them in code. Maybe this is sort of 2030 time frame rather than this decade, but the DAO as a template right now could lead to some very interesting automation of the justice system, of the healthcare system, of the banking and financial services space to get massive gains in terms of efficiency and reduce the overall cost of government. And that's where I think the DAO is, as a sort of core technology, is very exciting to look at.
Well, so it's funny you bring up the automation, because I've long been a fan of this idea of tighter integration between regulation and the regulated bodies, right? And it's so funny, it's met with such resistance, especially within financial services, because it leads to this concept of continuous regulation, which for the life of me, I still don't understand the resistance to that, because in my mind, there's nothing worse than this idea of, hey, let's go away for a long period of time. Then you come in, kind of hunting for things, the longer, and I think you've heard my talk on this, on the innovation regulation revolution, Brett, right? The longer the gap between kind of an incident and when it's discovered, the more widespread it's become and the more severe it is. Why not actually not only does it lower the cost of government, but it begins to minimize the impact of something really severe happening. It's like the equivalent of test and learn, but applied to, how do we, boldly go into this new frontier?
Absolutely.
So we talked about fintech and the massive year in fintech funding. Let's look on the traditional financial institution side here for a minute. M&A is picking up again. It was down in 2020. It was up again, not quite to the prior level. But the biggest deal of the year was kind of just overlooked as a fill-in acquisition. That's U.S. Bank's acquisition of MUFG Union Bank. But that was an $8 billion deal. That's the fourth largest deal since 2009. So what do you think about, when you look back last year, what's happening within the traditional infrastructure of regular banks and credit unions? And when we come back after the break, we'll start talking about where does this go in the future?
I'd love to quote Jim the Moose Maroose from the Fintech Fight Club at MX's Money Experience, where he had made this point, and I think it's maybe the most solid blow he landed on Ron the Shiv Shevlin, was, one of the lessons from the SNL crisis. I don't mean Saturday Night Live, I mean the savings and loan crisis, is if you take two institutions with poor strategies and you put them together, it does not suddenly make it a better strategy. It makes it a bigger poor strategy. Amen. And I'm not saying US Bank and Mufti is a bad M&A activity. It's just some of these things we see coming together in the mid-market, coming together with no clear identity about what do we uniquely do, and they're racing for scale. And I'll be honest, you're not going to race fast enough to keep up with the largest of the players, especially when you have someone like US Bank tucking in a small $8 billion transaction, right? You're just playing completely different games. And if you are an institution that is not one of those already at scale, you need to pull back and say, what is my strategy? Because an acquisition for branch footprint or for customers is a waste of capital. And I think today, in the game of, musical chairs, you're maybe getting a premium. I think that premium is going to get washed out pretty soon. And what we're going to see is you need to be doing acquisitions and tuck-ins that follow a unique strategy.
Well, and while it was actually announced in 2020, it became official in the first month of 2021, where you saw Lending Club acquire Radius Bank. And so we've seen much more of banks acquiring fintech companies in the last year, and I think we'll see more of that. Brett, what's your take on it from the traditional FIs?
Well, undoubtedly there's going to be further consolidation in the market because, we see these new entrants taking significant market share. A great stat from 2021, 38% of all salaries in the UK now are paid into a challenger bank. So that telescopes the market share issue that, traditional banks are going to face there. But I'm fully on board with, Jim's position on this. Can anyone say truest? But, if you look at HSBC as an example, right? HSBC grew to become, the world's largest bank in the late 80s, early 90s by branch acquisition. And now look at them. They're about to fall out of the top 20 banks in the world. This is not a strategy for growth in the 21st century. If you look at the fastest growing FIs, none of them have come through merger and acquisition deals. Right. All of the fastest growing FIs in terms of customer numbers right now are those that can acquire customers at digital scale. And the one thing we've learned over these last couple of years is that those organizations that have worked out, this low customer acquisition cost through digital channels had a significant advantage during the pandemic in terms of their ability to continue to grow versus those that relied on walk-ins in branches. And there's no data we see on the horizon, not a single shred of evidence to suggest that that's going to change. And so if you want to look at the core competency in 2022, you should have already had it sorted, in 2013, frankly. But the core competency is going to be that digital acquisition at scale. So these mergers, sometimes they make sense from an asset perspective. Sometimes they make sense from an operational efficiency perspective. But think about something like US Bank and MUFG, trying to work out the core systems landscape, of their legacy infrastructure and sort of bring that together versus the agility you have of, two fintechs that might merge, for example. You're talking about a very, very different proposition in terms of the ability to mobilize and attack a market. So I think one of the interesting things that we haven't as yet seen that we haven't seen, in terms of big mergers, but seeing some mergers in the fintech space starting to emerge over the next couple of years could be quite interesting because that's one of the ways we might get to see some really market dominant players. I could see Starling, for example, merging with someone else and doing a SPAC, or things like that. eToro and a couple of others did a SPAC this year on a similar pattern. So I think big banks are going to do, and the big capital market players are going to do, these sorts of mergers and look for these sorts of scales because they're good for shareholders, but that's about it.
Well, and even double that acquisition, just announced at the end of the year, BMO, Bank in Canada, is going to make a $16 billion deal acquiring Bank of the West from BNP Paribas. So when you think about those two and you think about PNC previously buying the U.S. operations of BBVA, even though we talk about fintech being global, banking's becoming maybe less so. Right? We're seeing less predominance from the institutions operating in the U.S. being owned by somebody from much further away.
How much of that is about, you look at HSBC's exit from the US market, this deal, maybe this is about distressed branch assets, and sort of right-sizing that, I don't know. I mean, I'm the death of the branch guy, so I'm always,
Well, when we come back, let's talk about looking forward. And before we finish our look back, Brett, we can't think of 2021 without mentioning the launch of your latest book, The Rise of Techno-Socialism. So a lot of the things that you talked about here, I know you've talked about in your book, and you'll bring back to talk about going forward. And Jason, you and I are working with, and Amber, more than 60 some banks now through the Alloy Labs Alliance. What's maybe your just last wrap-up thought on 2021 from the perspective of the incumbent players?
I think, maybe this is the misapplication, but you're going to see a lot of the incumbents, if they weren't already, but especially at the smaller level, have become woke. That they are woke to a number of things. And I'd say woke in its most proper context. The importance of social issues, and this ties back to Brett and techno-socialism, the importance of social issues at the community banking level has really, seed planted in 2020 has taken root, really grown in 2021. Institutions of sizes that you wouldn't expect really paying attention to ESG in a serious fashion. I love, because that is at the heart of, community, whether it's a physical or some other defined community, is important. I would say that the incumbent industry as a whole has also, reached a level of sentience on, yes, the world is changing and it is not going back. I either evolve with it or I go extinct. And you're seeing, I don't want to say it's a large number, but, those who are now aware of it are becoming, hypersensitive to what do I need to do to remain relevant?
Yeah, the one other thing that's really interesting this year is we've gone from talking about core systems, a few years ago, to talking about tech stack. So, that's a very interesting situation where years ago we talk about the need for real-time cores and all of that. And now we see a lot of effort being put into the middleware layer, cloud connectivity, APIs, all of those things. But generally an understanding that the tech stack is what's going to get you there in the future rather than, reinvigorating the core.
All right, well, let's start our look forward in 2022. What are the things that leaders need to be paying attention to?
Well, I think, if we're looking at trends, it'd be nice to sort of step back. We often, look at Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley here in New York as leaders in the fintech space. And yes, we have curated some really, big players in that respect. But a lot of the really interesting action is taking place outside of North America and, to some extent, Europe. Obviously, we just mentioned Nubank, which is the largest, Western challenger bank that IPO'd this year. But, WeBank in Shenzhen, they crossed the 200 million customer Rubicon, this year as well. 200 million customers. How many banks in the world have 200 million customers? They're only valued at 70 billion. But having said that, they are operationally probably the most efficient bank in the world. And then you've got, the digital banks in Hong Kong and Singapore. You had 86,400 acquired by NAB this year. So just on the challenger bank space alone, we've got some really interesting traction. But the big traction is still happening in the mobile wallet space. And this is something that is dramatically underestimated in terms of its impact to day-to-day banking. In 2020, we don't have the 2021 numbers as yet, but just Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay did $52 trillion of mobile payments through their two mobile wallets. And keep in mind, these are not the only mobile wallets in the world. We've obviously got, PayPal here in the US and, its derivatives. You've got M-Pesa in Kenya, Kakao in South Korea, Gcash in the Philippines, Paytm in India with over 500 million users on that platform now. But just the two Chinese mobile wallets did 52 trillion. That's almost twice the 32 trillion of all the global plastic cards, in terms of its transaction volume in 2020. This includes all credit cards and debit cards in the market globally. And the US, 300 billion in mobile wallet payments in 2020. So the US is so far from being competitive in respect to the mobile wallet space, but already mobile wallets account for more day-to-day payments than plastic cards globally. Now, from my point of view, this signifies a change in the way people use a bank account day to day, for particularly for retail transactions and running their discretionary funds for purchases and so forth. And I don't think banks, even challenger banks, necessarily really get that modality shift, that mobile wallets are getting so dominant so quickly in respect to day-to-day payments. But a lot of that activity is happening in places like Asia and Africa. And that's where I think it gets really interesting, because no doubt you're going to have those ecosystems really starting to compete with the likes of MasterCard and Visa. Not even to get into the fact that they don't have any interchange fees for merchants, as an example. There's some really interesting battle lines being drawn.
Well, cue here, Brett, call out to Alex Johnson whenever he wants to debate this one. I think, theme song out of Africa playing in the background here. I think 2022 is going to be the year that we see cracks in interchange. So if you're a neobank that relies on an interchange-based business model, it's going to start to change. And, for the naysayers that are like, people have been saying that forever. No. There's a couple huge market forces that make now the time. One is, look at the prevalence of the ability to use Amazon Pay and, Venmo and Stripe. There are now large private networks. I would love to see a bold play like Starbucks say, hey, wait a second, I've got this Starbucks app with this massive penetration. What if you could pay with Starbucks, right? And you're going to see this unbundling at the point of sale, whether it's digital or with what Venmo is doing at the physical point of sale, what Toast can do. There's this unbundling and this openness coming. And then, like you just said, when you look at what's happening in places like Africa, right, where interchange is zero, they don't have the incumbency of the card networks. I think 2022 is where we start to see this, begin to open up and change pretty dramatically. Not saying MasterCard and Visa are going away. I think they feel the threat, which is why they're running so hard at crypto and open and data, position plays.
Agree.
Well, I want to kind of marry those trends a little bit with where we talked about. Brett, I asked before the break if we're getting actually less international in the traditional FI side, and you said, well, maybe that is a reflection of the lesser value on owning a piece of a branch network in another country. And that's the flip side of what you two were just talking about now, is how much things where the future trends are coming from are outside of the country. And when I think about things like that, I think about floors and ceilings. And so one of the things in some of the international markets, particularly the lesser developed ones, there was a really low floor there. And the ability to offer something useful to people was a low floor opportunity. In the US, I just used my watch to pay for something on Apple Pay at a food pickup window. And I really took a moment back to think about, was that incredibly more convenient than pulling the card out of my wallet and putting it in the thing or tapping it to the card reader? Not necessarily. I did it because it was just kind of cool and interesting, and I wanted to see. The floor was a little bit higher. I mean, how do you think about how those trends are going to play in US and Europe, where there are kind of more developed infrastructures for things?
Well, the big problem that the US card schemes have is card not present fraud.
Yep.
We have 11.2 basis points of fraud in North America. These are 2019 numbers, but Alipay has 0.00006 basis points of fraud. 10,000 times less fraud because of the use of a modern tech stack and modern identity infrastructure. And I know there's a ton of debate around facial recognition and how we should use that in respect to identity, but I'm surprised at how slow, how much a laggard, Visa and MasterCard have been in respect to digital identity. We've tokenized the PAN.
Because they don't have the problem, Brett. They push it to the merchant, right? This is the whole issue. This is one of incentives, is they push it back to the merchant, right? And so they don't care. The bank doesn't care, right? And so it's time for the merchants to demand it.
Yeah, I absolutely, amen, brother. So that's one area that's obvious, to me. But I think the other element that's more difficult to do on those rails is sort of the value add stuff that we see emerging in the super app, landscape, where you've got scale of these wallet systems being able to get you access to a wide range of services, and delivery of those services very efficiently tied up with courier networks and driver networks and things like that. All of that is, I think, part of sort of the ecosystem play. So in the US, I do think we'll see more involvement from the likes of Amazon and others from a sort of a e-commerce infrastructure perspective around fintech for sure in 2022.
Yeah.
So if you are leading or starting or investing in a fintech startup today, what are the 2 or 3 things that you should be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, I think there are really kind of the 2 trends. You are either looking at the replumbing of financial services. How do we do it, in a better way to modernize the tech architecture, which I think is actually a great place to play. But I think it is also, we're going to see a little bit slower adoption there, just because you can't just rip out the guts of how our financial infrastructure works today, right? Like, the benefit of some of these emerging markets like Vietnam and Brazil and Africa, where they don't have the incumbency with tons of transactions, and by tons I mean millions of transactions happening every second. It's hard, to really go replumb that on the fly. But I'd say the second place, and this is where I think we're going to see the hyper growth, are very focused opportunities on those things that are reinventing banking. Right. And dear friends Andreessen Horowitz, said, every company is a fintech company. And I do think that's true, that what we're going to see that's most interesting is where financial technology, and this includes the incumbents, merge with the other parts of our lives. I know I'm overdoing writing at JP, but my big monologue around the edge of money, right? That money is the center, sitting in an app, sitting in a bank, sitting in a fintech. That's going to go away. That what we really need to do is get into this level of embeddedness and merge, right? This, when we talk about, first it was the disaggregation, now it's the emergence of kind of rebundling. I think that rebundling is going to extend beyond financial services.
This really emphasizes the need for good partner management. This is something that banks have been, frankly, atrocious at historically because it's all been very one-sided. You come to a bank and you're a vendor, you go through the procurement department and so forth. So, one of the things that fintechs are better at doing is sort of these, multi-platform, multi-technology partnerships. Starling's a good example of that in the UK. But others like Grab and Gojek in Indonesia and their partnerships they've put in place, we see some good examples of these sort of things emerging, but that ability to extend your footprint as a bank into the lives of your customers does require you to think outside of the walls of the bank. It's no longer the customer coming to you as the bank brand. It's now that you're there whenever they need it. And if we want a great illustration of this, and I don't think we really understand the impact of the growth of buy now, pay later, in US and European markets. But buy now, pay later is challenging credit cards. It's contextualization of credit in a more efficient way than applying for a credit card and using that at a later date. It's sort of the pundits may argue, well, it's a sort of an instant credit card, but it's the instant element of it embedded in the purchase price, which is the innovation. And, you can't innovate that with a credit card product in terms of improving the rewards or some other aspect of that. You have to compete with sort of this real-time capability. That means you have to extend your platform. You have to be open to partnerships, all of those things, which, just think about most of the top banks in the world. Do they even have a partnership development program? Do they even have capabilities internally on the org chart in terms of engaging those types of organizations, or is it sort of spread across various departments? This is going to be an absolute core competency of this decade for sure.
First of all, I'd say that the growth of buy now, pay later is something that most banks never saw coming, right? It didn't feel like anything was broken there. You need to pay for a large ticket item? Sure, put it on a credit card or apply for one or use your home equity or whatever. But secondly, you're taking this, Brett, exactly where I wanted to go next, which is I asked, what should you think about as a fintech funder? What should you think about if you're running a traditional player right now? And I want to go a little bit deeper on where you start with a partnership, because we have had 80,000 conversations here and everywhere else about, hey, banks and fintechs need to partner. But that always often, way too often, gets boiled down to some sort of vendor selection and risk management conversation. Say a little bit more from your perspective, Brett, and then Jason, I know you have a lot to say on that topic too.
Well, as Movin, we're doing a lot more partnerships with fintechs now. And, like we, as you guys know, we did a big partnership with a major wallet provider in the GCC region with STC Pay now, which we did in 2020. That's now starting to bear fruit. Those guys have over 5 million users on their mobile wallet, now. But it's long and hard and very tough to get deals with banks. And, you will inevitably have technology challenges in terms of trying to make things work. And you'll often have to, break new ground just to be able to have those successes. Whereas when you're working with fintechs, operationally you can execute much faster, contractually, and from a business agreement perspective, things happen in far less time than the lead times we have with major banks in terms of deals there. So just their ability to get deals done in the traditional space is a real challenge to making substantial progress on the technology and capability side for sure.
Well, I want to build on that technology and capabilities where we need to see the greatest unbundling, where we've had this focus on digital transformation. What we really need to see for those who are going to come out, I think, ahead of the pack in 2022 are those who focus on strategic transformation. that it really is about rethinking the who do I uniquely serve? What's my unique competitive advantage? How do I sustain it? Who do I actually compete with? And yes, I am always the acolyte of Michael Porter. Some of the best years of my life spent working with him. But if you don't actually go back and rethink who do I compete with, because it's not another bank, it's not a small bank competing with a big bank, it's not a small bank competing with the bank across the street, it's not even competing with the fintechs. You're competing for something else entirely in terms of what that user experience is that you led off with, Brett, that when we put ourselves in the eyes of the customer, none of them have banking problems. They have life problems of which banking, whether it's delivered by a bank, it's delivered by a non-bank, it's even feels like a bank, right? That is where the transformation needs to happen.
And again, part of that, Jason, is data, right? And we obviously have seen people talking about data as the new oil and so forth, but a lot of the data you need to be embedded in your customers' lives is data that banks don't have. It's behavioral data, it's location data. Yes, we can get some of that from some smart apps that we have embedded on the phone, but increasingly you're going to need data partnerships as well to be more and more relevant. So, if you think about just a simple proposition around mortgage, what's the number one data point that's going to help you win in the mortgage business in 2022 and beyond? It's knowing someone's intent to buy a home. Now, banks have to wait for a customer to come to the bank website and use a mortgage calculator or something like that to know that they intend to buy a home. Whereas, real estate websites like Zillow and realestate.com.au and these various websites, they know before the banks know about a customer's intent to buy. So it's those sort of data partnerships behaviorally that are going to be so much more important in the future for context and relevance.
And I think that that's a great example, but just a proxy for others, right? The banks have traditionally been too late in the chain, and therefore they participate too low in the value chain.
Well, they're reactive, right? I think that if we go back to first principles, why does the problem exist that Brett said is we're waiting for them to come into the branch. You hinted at that, JP, is we think they're going to come to us because we're the natural place to go shop, when the part of the user journey you need to intercept is much further up in the stack of things they care about, right? It is not, by the time they're thinking about a mortgage, you've lost.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. I mean, if you look at all of the activity we've had globally in terms of challenger banks, the tens of billions of dollars that went into challenger banks in terms of funding last year, the progress around buy now, pay later, what TransferWise has done with the transfer market, what Coinbase has done in terms of creating new asset classes, all of this activity has had to come from somewhere else in the market. We are talking about the fact we're seeing real formative changes in terms of market share and what the core of financial services is. Who would have imagined just 10 years ago that in 2021, the largest bank in Brazil, the second largest bank in Germany, and one of the largest banks in China were all banks that have been created basically since 2015, right? I mean, that is in itself an incredible milestone. Now, if you play that out, it has to be a significant threat to the market. Yes, community banks and the smaller banks, but I think there's some major players like the likes of HSBC and Deutsche and others who really must understand the level of threat that these market share level changes are having.
Well, and as we think about the traditional players, they have to work inside a regulatory environment. That's no small thing. Jason, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's no small thing, but one of the aspects that I would say, if we look back at Chairman McWilliams' tenure at the FDIC, one of the things that she did was brought this idea of let's go back to first principles on why does this regulation or rule exist, and contextually, how is it different? How does it need to be applied now versus let's follow the letter of the law, rule, regulation, you name it, and it might be out of context. Now, I think this is a challenge because how do you actually begin to disseminate that? If you think of just how big the financial service industry is in the US, right? In terms of the number of banks and credit unions, although that will be changing, the number of regulators that means when you say, oh, each one of these has, at least on the banking side, the FDIC, OCC, CFPB. They may have the SEC, they may have FINRA involved, they then have state bank supervisors, if they have international operations, right? So this is true of a lot of regulatory bodies across the US and across the world, where there are a lot of people with a very entrenched hierarchical system for ensuring consistency. So how do you actually begin to change that? And a big part of that is, I think, the automation part that Brett had hinted at. I think another part is the application of AI and machine learning to actually find things that people don't, right? That audits are really good at finding known characteristics and going back and testing those, that we not only need to automate, we need to add a level of intelligence to it. I think that's the opportunity in 2022 for a number of those things to begin to come to fruition.
Yeah, a different approach to this, of course, was China, where they sort of let these new entrants in the market have a lot of leeway, and the moves or the reshaping of the financial sector really, in the end, just was happening too quickly for the regulator to be comfortable with. It was introducing large-scale systemic risk, and you also have Jack Ma in there questioning the capabilities of the existing banking system, when the reality is, we are going to have to make an orderly transition. And so this has got to be done with some care. Having said that, regulators from this point forward, I see two major activities to Jason's point. One is figuring out how to automate supervisory capabilities and compliance monitoring, and also, criminal, policing criminal activities in the system. And the second piece is just purely the technology capabilities they're going to need to build to do that. We have never really seen regulators thought about as technology companies, and yet that's really where the core skills are for keeping regulators, or for the regulators to be able to perform their primary function, which is mitigating risk at a system level.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I don't know how to summarize it all in a few words, but maybe I'll just say this. There was plenty to not like about 2021 as a human being living on this planet. But if you're into fintech and the future of financial services and you liked what happened this year, you really can't wait for what's going to happen in 2022. If you hated it, you're really going to hate 2022.
Yeah, I think for those of us who've been in the fintech trenches for a decade or more, seeing that, as Jason said at the start, this, 2021 was when you could no longer deny the massive changes that fintech is bringing about in the entire financial services ecosystem. And for those of us that have been in the trenches for all of those years, it's validating. It's validating, but I would say the best is yet to come. We're just starting this journey, and particularly on the crypto side and DeFi, we've got a long way to go, but it's going to be a state of constant change, and 2022 is not going to be any different. And the number one skill set you need, whether you're in a bank or in a fintech, is adaptability.
Oh, Brett, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was about to say adaptability and flexibility, that come together. That Deloitte, in partnership with Harvard Business Review, did a survey a number of years ago, I think about 5 years ago now, for public companies. They judged it based on stock performance, but what characteristics make the highest performing CEO? And as measured quantitatively by stock performance, what they found is speed of decision making was number one, and number two was speed with which you were willing to remake the decision, right? And so that becomes what it really looks like, I think, at all layers of the bank. How fast can you make the decision? Realize, as Steve Blank says, the facts lie outside of the building, and then remake the decision with the facts that you've gathered.
Well, it sounds like good advice for 2022, and we'll leave it there. We'll be back with more Breaking Banks next week.
That's it for this week. If you like the show, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with a friend, or share it on social media.
We'll see you again next week with more Breaking Banks.